Good afternoon to all. I chair this second part of the forum. I am Alberto Quadrio Curcio and I am Vice President of the Board of the International Balzan Foundation Prize. And at the same time, I have the coordinator of the committee which organized the forum, organized the annual Balzan lecture, and organized also the so-called Interlab. The committee, as many of you know, is the composition of 3 representatives, Balzan Foundation Prize, Accademia dei Lincei, and the Swiss Academy of Arts and Sciences. Before giving the floor to the presentation of the prize winner, I want to say some word about this booklet. This booklet is really amazing because in more or less 55 years, we see what happened in the highest sphere of sciences and humanities. I don't think, as far as I know, that there is another example like that in the important worldwide prizes. So I have to greet more and more Balzan Foundation for having started such important initiative with the 2 parts of one only and united community, that of cultural scientists, or science and cultures, at plural, which has no gender at all, sciences and cultures. In my opinion, this prize has built a bridge which is not evident in all other important prizes. So I am sure that all of you agrees with me saying that Balzan Foundation is probably unique in the worldwide scenario of important prizes. Having said that, my role as a coordinator is to give the floor for the presentation of the 2 prize winners for this year, the presentation of Michael Cook for Islamic Studies and the presentation of Jacques Mon for Film Studies. So I ask Professor Salwa El-Savan Castelo Blanco, member of Balzan General Prize Committee, to come here to present Professor Michael Cook. Please. I think that you speak from here is much better. How are you? Nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you.
I sit down here.
So, dear representative of the President of the Swiss Academy of Arts and Sciences, dear Vice President of the International Balzan Foundation, dear President of the International Balzan Foundation Prize, dear Chair of the General Balzan Foundation Committee, Prize Committee, dear everyone. It is truly a pleasure and a great honor for me to be standing here to say a few words about Professor Michael Cook, who is the prize winner for Islamic Studies. And the committee had no hesitation in selecting Professor Michael Cook from among a long list and a short list for the exceptional impact of his work on several research areas in the enormous field of Islamic studies, most notably the study of the origin and early history of Islamic thought, the intellectual, social, and political history of Islam through the ages, and the place of Islam in global history, for the outstanding quality of his scholarship in depth, temporal and geographical breadth, and methodological rigor, as well as the use of a comparative approach, and for the meticulous philological analysis of primary sources in Arabic, Ottoman Turkish, Persian, Hebrew, Syriac, South Arabian, and Sanskrit. In the few words I will say here, I only cover only a part of what Professor Cook has produced. Michael Cook is one of the leading contemporary historians of Islam. He has made a major contribution to the advancement of the field of Islamic studies. It is a very large interdisciplinary field. His work has been largely acclaimed by specialists in Western academia, as well as in the Arab world and in Iran. He is a prolific erudite scholar with 8.5 authored books. I had a larger number, but Professor Cook corrected me, and so the 8.5 is his underlining. Dozens of articles and several edited volumes, including the monumental 6-volume, The New Cambridge History of Islam. And this is an incredible set of volumes with authoritative studies. This is a landmark that maps and updates the field of Islamic studies. A number of his books have been translated into several Western and Middle Eastern languages. Professor Cook is also a highly respected teacher and mentor to several generations of prominent scholars in the field of Islamic studies. Professor Cook's publications deal with a wide range of subjects covering the history and geography of Islam, but with special focus on the formation of Islamic civilization and the role played by religious values in that process. Some of the topics he has dealt with include pre-Islamic Arabia, Quranic studies, early Hadith studies, the life of the Prophet Muhammad and his companions, Islamic theology, ethics and law, the histories of the Umayyad and Abbasid and later Islamic dynasties, the history of Arabia and Wahhabism, the politics of Hindu, Christian, and Islamic fundamentalism, both medieval and modern. At the beginning of his career, he focused on the economic and social history of the South Ottoman Empire in the early modern period, moving on to the origins of Islam and the development of Muslim doctrine, extending his focus to the central concepts of Muslim intellectual and legal history and Islam's place in global history, as well as a host of other topics. Professor Cook's scholarship is truly outstanding in all the senses that I mentioned above. His seminal publication, Commanding Right and Forbidding Wrong in Islamic Thought, which was published by Cambridge University Press in the year 2000, and which also has Persian and Arabic translations, has been widely acclaimed as a masterpiece, an example of traditional philological Orientalism at its best. Based on a thorough analysis of hundreds of manuscripts and printed sources in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, this book provides an in-depth reading of the central ethical Islamic principle of commanding right and forbidding wrong in Islamic law and Islamic legal discussions, how it was understood and applied by all sects and schools of Islamic theology and law. Professor Cook begins with the Quran and then proceeds chronologically through to the late 20th century, tracing its impact on the daily life and social organization of Muslim believers. The book also compares these principles with ethical injunctions in other religious as well as secular traditions and values in the West. His short books, the Quran, a very short introduction, and Muhammad, present the results of thorough scholarship in an accessible and engaging style aimed at the general reader, while at the same time critically discussing issues of interest to specialists, such as the reliability of early Islamic sources written 2 centuries after the events, the authenticity of Muslim tradition, the cultural and religious context in which Islam and its prophet emerged, and the conditions under which the Quran was put together. Professor Cook's most recent monograph, Ancient Religions, Modern Politics, the Islamic Case in Comparative Perspective, that I mentioned earlier, is a study of the role of religious tradition in modern politics. Here, Professor Cook proceeds by way of a comparison of identity, social values, and politics in Hinduism, Catholicism in Latin America, and Islam, from their inception up to the present. This study can be read as a contribution not merely to Islamic, but to global history. To sum up, Professor Cook's work has had a major impact on several research areas of Islamic studies, most notably the study of the origin and early history of Islamic thought, the intellectual, social, and political history of Islam throughout the ages, and the place of Islam in global history.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Salwa, for that very generous introduction. Salwa and I actually have a rather special connection, the one we didn't know about until after the prize was announced. That's to say that in my family, my younger brother walked off with all the musical talent, and he is a musicologist, and he and Salwa have worked together in that musicological field. I'd like to thank the Balsan Foundation for the incredible honor they have done me and for this extraordinary event. More on that tomorrow. I'd like to thank the Balsan staff for all they've done for us and are doing for us. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here this afternoon. And that includes my wife, Kim, who is sitting somewhere thereabouts. Without her, I wouldn't be here. I'd also, maybe this is being a bit frivolous or a bit sentimental, but if this stage was a bit higher than it actually is, I'd like to think that the spirit of Eugenio Balsan was underneath it, listening to our proceedings. Okay, in the paper which I wrote for Suzanne Werder earlier, last month, I talked a lot about my formative years and my career. What I plan to do this afternoon is to skip most of that in the interest of talking about the kind of thing that I do now being a rather extensive now that goes back, say, 2 decades. The bits and the research that I've been doing over that period. But before I come to that, there is one reminiscence from long, long ago that I can't bear to pass up. This goes back to the year when I was a schoolboy at the Edinburgh Academy, a fine institution. I must have been 12 years old. Our science teacher that year was Mr. Booth. And at the beginning of the term, Mr. Booth walked into the class and announced that we would be studying combustion. So he then asked us what we thought happened when things burned. And I'm sorry to say we hadn't the faintest idea. So he then set out the phlogiston theory. That's the 18th century theory of combustion that came before the oxygen theory. And he wrote the main points on the blackboard, and we wrote it all down. And of course we believed it, because that's what our teacher had told us. But then Mr. Booth said that in science, it's not enough just to accept received wisdom. You have to test it. So we devised an experiment to test the phlogiston theory, and sure enough, the phlogiston theory came out with flying colors. But Mr. Booth said that one experiment wasn't quite enough. We had to do a second experiment. And that second experiment turned out very differently. The phlogiston theory fell flat on its face. And Mr. Booth then cleared away the debris and told us about the oxygen theory and wrote the points on the blackboard, and we wrote it down. And then, of course, we knew what was coming next. We did 2 experiments, and each time the oxygen theory came out with flying colors. And ever since then, I've believed in the oxygen theory, and I've never forgotten that experience. It's perhaps the best piece of education that I ever had. It has, I think, quite deeply affected the way I think. No, rather, I should say, the way that I try to think. And it's also left me with a very high standard of proof that I rarely manage to live up to in the work I do now. Okay, the work I do now, as you know, is in Islamic studies. Most of it focuses on the pre-modern period, by which I mean something like before 1800. But some of it, as Salwa made clear, does have a modern dimension, does bear on the world we now live in. And I thought I'd take a couple of examples of that kind of research to tell you about this afternoon. And the first is the book I published in the year 2000, the book that Salwa told you quite a bit about, so I can be more brief, Commanding Right and Forbidding Wrong. And this is a book about one specific Muslim duty, just one duty, and we can call it for short the duty of forbidding wrong. It's the duty of each and every Muslim to intervene in the face of wrongdoing. And as Salwa mentioned, it's a duty that is discussed across sectarian barriers in the Islamic world. It's discussed in all regions of the Islamic world. It's discussed up and down the centuries and into the modern period. And this scholastic discussion raises many knotty questions. For example, supposing that you have good reason to think that your intervention would get you beaten up, are you still obligated to intervene? Or supposing you have good reason to think that your intervention would achieve nothing, are you still obligated to intervene? Or supposing some norms of privacy would be infringed by your intervention, do you still have an obligation to intervene? So you can imagine that there is an enormous scholastic literature on this duty. There is excruciating detail there, and that is why my book runs to 702 pages. Now, frankly, I think that is a human rights violation to write a book that long, and I fully intend never to do it again, but I'm afraid it happened that time. Now, I don't want to inflict that excruciating scholastic detail on you. What I want to do is to pull out a couple of things from that book, things which I think are of wider interest and worth highlighting. First of all, there is a major question that I discuss in that book, namely whether this duty is uniquely Islamic. It's Islamic, but is it uniquely Islamic? And the answer is no. That is to say, there are parallels. The parallels are found in other monotheist religions, interestingly enough, not, to my knowledge, in non-monotheist religions. You get a kind of counterpart or set of counterparts in Judaism, and you also get it in Christianity, where we have a duty of fraternal correction that the Catholic scholastics discussed from the 13th century onwards, again in very considerable detail and in a style that is immediately recognizable to anyone coming from the Islamic scholastic discussion of the duty. But there are nevertheless important differences between the Islamic duty and its counterparts in Judaism and Christianity. And I think the most striking of them is that in the discussion of the Muslim duty, one possible form of intervention is physical, could actually be violent. You don't find that paralleled in either the Jewish or the Christian counterparts. For example, I have a 10th century Muslim scholar who is talking about the duty, and he kind of boasts that the Muslims are the only ones who perform this duty when you have to go to the lengths of fighting. Jews and Christians don't. A very clear sense of the difference already back there in the 10th century. Now, this is just one striking example, but what it all boils down to is that this duty is just much more elaborately developed and much more salient in the Islamic case than it is in the Catholic or the Jewish case. So that's one thing that I think is worth pulling out. The Islamic duty is not unique, but it is different. The other thing that I'd like to pull out here is the attention paid to this duty in modern times in the Islamic world. Now, I mean, when you have a medieval heritage that is passed down to modern heirs, what you can always expect is that some parts of the heritage will get much more attention than other parts, because the modern heirs will feel that some parts of the heritage are relevant to their own situation and that some parts are not. And emphatically in the Islamic case, the modern heirs of this tradition pay a lot of attention to the duty of forbidding wrong. Basically, what they're doing with it is using it to underwrite political activism and using it to domesticate, if you like, to Islamicize various principles that have high prestige in the modern world and have great resonance just about everywhere. It's not just political participation, it's also freedom of speech, and even the idea of revolution is underpinned with reference to this duty. So those are the 2 points I wanted to pull out. Now let me ask a couple of much more adventurous questions, basically 2 forms of the same question. How far is this duty just something discussed, so to speak, within the history of ideas, and how far does it have real-world implications, real-world impact? And my hunch is that it does actually have a certain impact in the real world, and that it is related to the real world. If we go back to the origin of the duty, my hunch would be that it's not just a product of the history of ideas, it's also a product of the context in which Islam took shape. That is to say, the formation of a monotheist religion in an Arabian tribal environment. Now, what is so special about an Arabian tribal environment? Well, basically that rulers and armies are pretty little to be found there, that what you have is tribes, and every adult male tribesman is a politician and a warrior in his own right. So my hunch is that that tribal environment, in combination with monotheism, is what accounts for the high profile of the duty in early Islam. Why do I think that it may have a real-world impact at the present day? Well, basically because what it does, as I showed you, is to underwrite, to legitimize political activism, and thereby it encourages it, and that encouragement is likely to increase it. That's my hunch, but I think I might have a hard time persuading Mr. Booth of that proposition. Okay, that's really all I wanted to say about that book. The next example I want to give you comes from something that I worked on not so long ago. I definitely have not completed whatever research I might do for it. I have not published it, and I may well never publish it. But it was something I felt I needed to think about, and that is sectarian troubles in the Muslim world today. I mean, if you look around the world today, you'll see that in the Muslim world, along sectarian fault lines, earthquakes are rather frequent now and in the recent past, the last few decades, overwhelmingly between Sunnis and Shiites. If you go to the rest of the world, it's hard to find many parallels to that in the contemporary scene and the recent past. I mean, if we take Christianity, I'm aware of two parallels. One, of course, is Northern Ireland, where sectarian conflict between Catholics and Protestants was a lethal matter between the 1960s and 1998, and is still a source of great tension. This is one of the worries, as I'm sure you know, about the impact of Brexit. The other example is maybe less well known. It's in the southern Mexican state of Chiapas. Again, what we have is Catholic-Protestant sectarianism. The Catholicism is folk Catholicism. The context is not Spanish speakers, it's indigenous Mayan communities. And ever since the 60s and ongoing at the present day, we have had nasty conflict between Catholics and Protestants there that typically result in the expulsion of large numbers of Protestants from these Mayan communities. But this is completely untypical of Latin America at large. If we go instead to Hinduism, I mean, in the past, just as in the Christian past, there was violent sectarian conflict. But in the recent past, the only example you can find, or at least that I could find, was the case of the Sikhs from the late 1970s into the 1990s, that Sikh insurrection. You could construe that as a sectarian conflict. Apart from that, Shaivas and Vaishnavas, the traditional sectarian groupings of pre-modern Hinduism, nothing happens on those fault lines. Okay, so the obvious question is why? Why are Muslim fault lines more prone to earthquakes now and in the recent past than, say, Christian or Hindu fault lines? And it's very obvious that a couple of modern factors are very important here. One is the Islamic revival. That revival has had the effect of highlighting sectarian boundaries, sectarian fault lines, and, if you like, resurrecting medieval sectarian controversies that people had begun to forget. I'm not sure that religious revival necessarily has that effect on sectarian fault lines. I mean, if you think about another major religious revival in the world today, Pentecostalism in Latin America, it has not, to my knowledge, produced a spate of sectarian earthquakes, killings, riots, whatever. But nevertheless, it does seem to be the case that the Islamic revival has had the effect of exacerbating sectarian tension. And the other modern development that has the same effect, and I think quite unquestionably has that effect, is the activity of states, and in particular 2 states which are exporters of sectarian conflict in the Muslim world. One is Saudi Arabia, exporting Sunni sectarianism, and the other is Iran, exporting Shiite sectarianism. So, I mean, there are good reasons to do with modern developments, good reasons or bad reasons, so to speak, but fairly persuasive reasons for why sectarian tensions have been exacerbated in the Muslim world. But of course, all this, both these modern factors, presuppose that the sectarian fault lines were already there and meant something to people. If they weren't there or didn't mean anything to people, then it would be very hard. There would be nothing to exacerbate. But the question that really interests me, and the one where, again, I would have a hard time convincing Mr. Booth of anything, is whether there is something about pre-modern Muslim sectarian fault lines that is inherently more earthquake-prone than Christian or Hindu ones. And I think there is one feature, I mean, I cast around a lot, but there's one feature that I think is at least it would be worthwhile to think about it more and try to research it a bit. And that is, here I need to invent a term, the sovereign sect. What I mean is that typically Islamic sects see themselves as rightfully constituting polities. And in some cases, if they've had history on their side, they have actually realized, they have actually constituted themselves as sectarian polities. By contrast, when I look at Hindu and Christian sects, this phenomenon seems to be considerably less frequent. The only example I know in Hinduism is the Sikhs in the last couple of 100 years. They very definitely came to see themselves as a sovereign sect, as at one time in practice, and after that in principle, a political community with a state. And I think it's maybe no accident that the Sikhs are also the one Hindu sect that has engaged in sectarian conflict in recent times. On the Christian side, let me simply refer to Max Weber, who actually makes sects by definition apolitical. Now, I mean, I don't go with his terminology, I don't go with his definition, but the very fact that he could conceive of sects as inherently unpolitical, I think says something about Christian sectarianism. So there is there a feature of pre-modern Islamic sects that I think could repay further investigation and may play some part in what we're seeing at the present day. Now, I think I have 5 minutes left, and I'll use it to go to one small piece of work that I did. Well, I must have actually done the work in the 90s. It was published in 1999, So it just kind of gets into my 20-year period. I published this work under the title Ibn Qutayba. He was a 9th century Muslim author, and the monkeys. Now, what this is about is an embarrassing tradition. Now, there are thousands and thousands of traditions handed down, some from the Prophet, some from his companions, some from later authorities. This particular tradition comes down not from the Prophet or a companion, but from a very long-lived Yemeni who ended his days in the city of Kufa in Iraq. And he had this reminiscence that back in pre-Islamic times in Yemen, he had seen monkeys stoning to death a female monkey for adultery. And he adds rather sweetly, and I joined in. Now, that was an embarrassing tradition for two reasons. The first reason, it was obvious to anybody back in the 9th century that this was nonsense. It didn't make any sense. But the other reason is that this tradition found its way into Bukhari's collection of traditions. Bukhari was a 9th century collector of traditions, and his collection became, in effect, the second most prestigious book in Islam after the Quran itself. So to have that tradition there was embarrassing. Why did he put it in? Well, for my money, it comes in a section which has all sorts of comic and curious traditions. They're not serious stuff going back to the Prophet. Bukhari was a teacher, he had students, and every now and again he needed to make a joke. And I'm sure that his students laughed when they heard this tradition. But that's not an explanation that scholastics can use. So if you like to see a scholastic tradition in damage control mode, that tradition is a splendid opportunity. But what I find particularly interesting about that tradition is not the scholastic reverberations. It's the fact that it shows, not the tradition, but the discussion of that tradition back in the 9th century. It shows a very considerable knowledge of monkey sexual behavior among Arab authors of the time. The way Arab authors of the time describe it, monkeys have marriage, and they have adultery, and they have male sexual jealousy. Now that may sound to you just like some kind of projection of our own human condition onto monkeys, but it isn't. When I've been saying monkeys, that's the standard translation of the Arabic term, but the monkeys in question would undoubtedly have been Hamadryas baboons. That is a species at home, its homeland is in Africa, but somehow it's spilled over into southwestern Arabia. And it was studied very interestingly and meticulously by Hans Kummer, a Swiss ethologist who I think died in 2013. He wrote a fascinating book about it. And what comes out of that book for me is that there is an analog to marriage among those baboons. That is to say, a mature adult male will have what the ethologists call projecting a harem. A mature adult male will have, say, 3 or 4 or 5 female consorts. Those female consorts are very willing to engage in sexual activity with immature males when their mature male is not looking. If the mature male catches them, he punishes his female in a way that is very easily interpreted as jealousy. In other words, what we have here is a remarkably good fit between 9th century Arab zoological observations and the actual behavior of this species. The knowledge that they have is something completely missing, to the best of my knowledge, in the classical Greco-Roman as a zoological literature about monkeys and apes. That information is just not there. It first appears in these Arabic sources in the 9th century. And what I find particularly satisfying about this is there is a tremendous tendency in my field and probably in all fields or many other fields of the humanities to dismiss what pre-modern people tell us about this, that and the other as mere projection. And this initially looks like mere projection, but it turns out not to be. It turns out to be rather good information. Okay, that's the third example and the final example I wanted to give you. I hope that I've said enough to convince you that the kind of issues that I work on and that colleagues in my field work on are intriguing and that they are also from time to time relevant to the world we live in. Thank you.
Many thanks to Professor Cook for this splendid lecture. Looking to the motivation for the prize, I find extremely important the starting point in which he says, the Commission says, for the exceptional impact of his work on several research areas in Islamic studies. I have to say that many young people looking to your works decided to go into Islamic studies. So many thanks also for that. Many thanks. Now we have the presentation of the Balzan Prize winner on film studies, Professor Jacques Aumont. Sorry? Sorry. No, we had a change because we are running out of time, and so we put together the two prize winners, and then we have, calling each one by name, what kind of problem you have, and I am sure that they will solve it anyhow. Good? So, for the film studies, the prize winner is Jacques Aumont, is going to be presented by Victor Stoikita and Peter Kwon, both members of Balzan General Prize Committee. Please, Professor Stoikita, and then Professor Peter Kwon. Both speak very good Italian, but we tolerate that they don't speak Italian, even if they both speak very well Italian. So, go.
Dear Chair, dear everyone, the next presentation will be in French, just to honor one of the national languages of Switzerland. C'est la première fois que le Comité général des prix décerne un prix Balzan aux études cinématographiques. Le fait que nous sommes deux, Victor Stoikita, historien de l'art, et moi, historien de la littérature, à présenter le lauréat, Jacques Aumont, montre bien que cette discipline éminemment transversale pose des exigences qu'il vaut mieux affronter à deux, voire à plusieurs. Il y a plus d'un siècle que le cinéma s'est joint au concert des muses. Il y a à peine 50 ans que les études cinématographiques se sont implantées dans les universités du monde entier. Devenir discipline académique veut dire passer d'une réflexion sur le cinéma qui se faisait avant tout, et je simplifie beaucoup, entre cinéphiles, qu'ils soient créateurs ou critiques, de passer à l'effort de définir l'objet de la recherche et de se doter des outils théoriques et méthodologiques pour la mener à bien. Mais d'abord, une telle recherche académique, je ne dis pas vérifiable, mais contrôlable, a besoin de disposer de son objet. Tant que les films restaient confinés dans les salles de cinéma et ne pouvaient être vus qu'au hasard de leur projection, la recherche et l'enseignement universitaire ont connu des limites évidentes. Tout change, on ne le souligne pas assez, avec les nouvelles technologies qui ont permis l'enregistrement des films à usage privé, la possibilité d'interrompre la vision, de ralentir et d'accélérer, bref, d'étudier un film en profondeur. Ces nouvelles technologies, cassettes vidéo, DVD, streaming, etc., ont eu un rôle important pour la transformation des études cinéma en discipline universitaire. Dans un premier temps, cette ambition académique a été marquée par le tournant structuraliste des sciences humaines. C'est en adaptant les concepts et méthodes de la sémiologie et de la narratologie, c'est en définissant leur objet par rapport à la langue, au texte ou au récit, que les études du cinéma ont cherché à gagner leur quartier de noblesse académique. Giacomo, et avec ces paroles, je passe le relais à Victor Stoichitsa, a été l'un des premiers à surmonter cette approche hétéronome en insistant sur l'autonomie de l'objet film, défini comme image mouvante, et en poursuivant une réflexion cohérente sur l'esthétique propre du cinéma.
Alors, il m'incombe la tâche et l'honneur de présenter le candidat et le vainqueur de ce prix qui est Giacomo sur la toile de fond du développement des études cinématographiques. Quelques notions supplémentaires. On a eu plusieurs candidatures, ce qui est normal, entre 20 et 30 candidatures qui venaient des deux continents, de l'Europe, mais aussi des Amériques, donc de l'Amérique du Nord et de l'Amérique du Sud, des tendances différentes. Un autre choix s'est posé justement sur Giacomo, et je voudrais le justifier. Donc, premièrement, c'était la qualité de ses recherches, donc le niveau de sa contribution aux études cinématographiques depuis maintenant plusieurs décennies. Mais notre choix a aussi une raison méthodologique, justement, peut-être qu'on vient de le dire, donc ce foisonnement de questions concernant comment est-ce qu'on peut approcher le film nous a mené vers ce choix qui est tout à fait justifié. Donc, pour bien le justifier, je voudrais citer un des titres des livres le plus intéressants de Giacomo. Le titre est le suivant: « Comment le cinéma est-il devenu le plus singulier des arts ?» Point d'interrogation, je pense, ou non, je ne sais pas. Alors, permettez-moi de disséquer un peu ce titre. Donc, comment le cinéma est-il devenu le plus singulier des arts ? On comprend que le cinéma est ou serait un art singulier. On comprend aussi qu'il y a eu une histoire. Le cinéma est devenu un art, disons, singulier, à fur et à mesure, gentiment. Donc il y a dans ce titre donc, tout un projet qui traverse en effet l'activité de Giacomo. Il y a d'un côté la démarche historique, donc histoire du cinéma, mais aussi une focalisation sur le spécifique du langage cinématographique. Donc comment le cinéma est-il devenu un art singulier ? Dans la vision de Giacomo, le cinéma est un art singulier, un art figuratif, un art narratif, mais il faut déceler justement comment la figuration et la narration travaillent dans l'œuvre d'art cinématographique. Pour cela, il faudra placer l'œuvre d'art cinématographique dans un contexte, dans le contexte des arts, et en effet, un des livres les plus connus de Giacomo traite du rapport entre peinture et cinéma. C'est un lapsus entre le cinéma et la peinture. Alors, non, c'est un lapsus d'historien de l'art, je m'excuse. Je suis historien de l'art, alors vous avez vu, donc le rapport entre peinture et cinéma n'est pas exactement ce que faisait Giacomo. Il traitait du rapport entre le cinéma et l'histoire de la peinture. Donc c'est un peu différent. Donc c'est un livre, peut-être le livre le plus connu, traduit dans plusieurs langues, où il démontre en effet qu'il y a un rapport entre l'œuvre d'art cinématographique et l'œuvre d'art pictural, mais à des différences inhérentes. Donc, le mouvement, un certain type de narration, etc., etc. Et puis, il y a d'autres écrits qui vont dans la profondeur donc, du langage cinématographique, de sa spécificité esthétique. Et cela toujours sur un fond historique. Donc il y a tout un côté de monographie que Giacomo a écrit, consacré pour la plupart à des cinéastes, à des réalisateurs très forts qui ont marqué l'histoire du cinéma depuis Sergei Einstein jusqu'à Godard ou Carmelo Bene. Donc des personnalités qui ont contribué justement dans la cristallisation de l'objet d'études cinématographiques. Ici, il y a un aspect sur lequel je voudrais dire quelques mots. Une activité de 40 ans dans les études cinématographiques a accompagné aussi une évolution du cinéma. Donc le cinéma des années 60 ou 70 n'est pas exactement le cinéma d'aujourd'hui. La science cinématographique des années 70 n'est plus exactement ce qu'elle est aujourd'hui. Il y a ce parallélisme extrêmement intéressant de l'évolution d'une discipline et de l'évolution de l'objet de l'étude qui est vraiment extrêmement significatif dans le parcours de Giacomo, qui est un parcours un peu atypique. Giacomo est de formation scientifique. Il a commencé comme ingénieur et ce n'est pas un hasard, il me semble qu'il y a eu dans ce parcours cette évolution assez atypique, singulière peut-être, mais significative. Je voudrais donner quelques repères un peu plus concrets. À côté de ces publications scientifiques, il y a aussi l'activité pédagogique, il y a l'activité, je dirais, de critique militant ou d'organisateur dans le cadre de certaines revues très importantes comme Trafic ou Presse, l'activité dans le comité de rédaction des revues importantes, Cinémathèque au cinéma, dont le programme était de marier justement l'histoire, l'esthétique et la critique. Il faut mentionner également sa direction du Collège d'histoire de l'art cinématographique au sein de la Cinémathèque française, où il a produit plusieurs cycles, des conférences de grande qualité, presque tous publiés par la suite, ou bien l'organisation d'un désormais légendaire colloque de Cerisy-Lassalle en 1985, colloque légendaire ayant le titre « Nouvelles approches de l'histoire du cinéma ». Aumont est lu, connu et traduit dans de très nombreux pays, du Brésil à la Corée, en passant par l'Angleterre, l'Espagne, l'Italie, le Portugal, le Liban. Il doit cette image de fondateur des études cinématographiques sans doute aux circonstances qui l'ont fait participer à leur invention institutionnelle, mais aussi à une indubitable générosité pédagogique. Je vous remercie.
So the floor is now to Professor Jacques Aumont, prize winner for 2019. Congratulations again.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à mes deux rapporteurs et anges gardiens qui m'ont beaucoup aidé dans la rédaction de mon projet de recherche. Je les en remercie publiquement et personnellement. Merci à la Fondation Balzan qui me fait un honneur tout à fait inattendu, qui en même temps que moi, j'en suis tout à fait conscient, honore ce qui est peut-être une discipline, en tout cas ce qui est un champ de recherche et de réflexion évidemment important et qui dépasse très largement ma modeste personne. Et merci pour cette présentation faite à l'instant, mais merci oui et non parce que vous avez fait mon exposé, Peter et Victor. Alors maintenant, que me reste-t-il à dire? Eh bien, il me reste à dire peut-être la même chose, mais un peu autrement. Ce qui me distingue un peu, je crois, et même parfois beaucoup de tous les collègues impressionnants qui m'ont précédé, c'est que leurs domaines sont évidemment très spécialisés et que, en gros, les profanes n'y comprennent rien. Le cinéma, en revanche, tout le monde connaît. François Truffaut avait lancé une boutade qui était « Tout le monde a deux métiers en France, le sien est critique de cinéma ». Ça reste vrai. Et je crois qu'aujourd'hui encore, quand on dit cinéma, tout le monde dit « Mais oui, bien sûr, je vais au cinéma, donc je sais ce que c'est ». Vous avez raison, tout le monde sait ce que c'est, mais comment donc peut-on étudier ce que tout le monde connaît et ce que tout le monde sait? C'était là la vraie difficulté, en fait, des études cinématographiques, et parfois ça le reste. Si vous permettez, je vais m'appuyer sur un petit échantillon, si on peut voir les 2 minutes que j'ai préparées. Oui, ça commençait bien. Diable. Alors là, je me retrouve exactement comme il y a 40 ans, quand je donnais mes premiers cours et que le film se cassait. Est-ce qu'on peut éteindre ça ? Voilà, c'est un échantillon extrêmement bref. Si j'avais pris un échantillon plus long, nous aurions passé la soirée. Mais il suffit à bien montrer que le cinéma, c'est beaucoup de choses très différentes. Ici, nous avons quoi dans l'ordre? Nous avons un film grand public, ce qu'on appelle un blockbuster, du genre merveilleux, ce qu'on appelle fantasy. destiné plutôt pour un public d'adolescents, mais que les vieux dans mon genre aiment bien aussi, qui a beaucoup de succès, qui a été fait avec de gros moyens et qui suit des formules narratives et représentatives éprouvées avec beaucoup de professionnalisme et de bonne qualité. Ensuite, un échantillon tout à fait différent d'un film réalisé avec 3 sous par quelqu'un qui travaillait chez lui, hors de tout circuit économique, dont les films étaient montrés à de petits groupes d'amateurs et de connaisseurs dans des salles plus ou moins difficiles à trouver, et qui ressortit en gros à ce qu'on a appelé parfois le cinéma expérimental à cette époque-là, auparavant le cinéma d'avant-garde ou le cinéma poétique plus récemment, ou le cinéma personnel, il y a beaucoup d'étiquettes. Et puis, troisièmement, une vue lumière. J'en ai choisi une tournée en Suisse, bien entendu, et ça vous aura valu d'entendre un commentaire assez étrange de Thierry Frémaux, qui se permet des généralités sur les Suisses que je n'aurais jamais osé émettre pour ma part. Je me désolidarise du commentaire de cette vue lumière. Qu'est-ce qu'une vue lumière? C'est un objet historique, c'est du cinéma, bien entendu, c'en est l'état premier, mais aujourd'hui, c'est une antiquité. C'est quelque chose donc qu'on traite comme une antiquité, avec respect, ou bien qu'on traite avec la désinvolture, au fond, qu'on manifeste envers ce qu'on appelle le patrimoine. C'est plutôt l'attitude de Frémaux ici, qui fait un petit commentaire ironique, tout ça reste pas très important. Tout ça, c'est du cinéma. J'aurais pu y ajouter beaucoup de choses, bien entendu. J'aurais pu ajouter les documentaires que vous voyez à la télévision ou qui maintenant sont devenus un genre assez important dans les salles de cinéma. J'aurais pu y ajouter l'avatar le plus récent de la fiction en images mouvantes qui est la série, tout ce que vous voyez sur Netflix ou sur Apple si vous préférez. Et j'aurais pu y ajouter encore de très nombreux genres ou espèces de films. Étudier le cinéma, est-ce que c'est étudier tout cela? Pas nécessairement. Il existe d'innombrables spécialisations et aujourd'hui j'ai des collègues spécialisés dans à peu près chacune de ces catégories. Mais a priori, étudier le cinéma, les études cinématographiques, oui, c'est étudier tout cela sans exclusive. Parce que c'est de l'image en mouvement et que toutes les images en mouvement socialement diffusées, même si la diffusion est faible, ont au fond le même statut. Elles servent à montrer quelque chose du monde, parfois d'un monde tout à fait imaginaire ou tout à fait intime, et elles servent à le montrer selon des procédures techniques qui sont bien connues de tous maintenant, je n'insiste pas, mais qui sont très évolutives, rapidement évolutives, et elles servent à le montrer surtout, et c'est ce qui m'a principalement occupé durant mes années de recherche, elles servent à le montrer par des images, c'est-à-dire des images, on sait très bien que c'est une des premières inventions de l'humanité, peut-être la toute première, et que depuis quelques dizaines de milliers d'années, les images ont sur nous un impact, une influence, elles nous apportent des informations et des émotions. Comment étudier cet objet multiforme ? Je vais en faire l'histoire alors à toute vitesse parce que je ne peux pas faire autrement, mais ce qui continue de m'émerveiller, c'est qu'il y ait eu, il y a plus d'un siècle, en 1916, un premier ouvrage déjà très savant qui était dû à un psychologue, élève de Wundt et élève par la suite de William James, ce qui fait qu'il est passé d'Allemagne aux États-Unis et il est mort d'ailleurs juste après avoir écrit en 1916 son petit livre « The Photoplay », A Psychological Study, une étude psychologique, c'était un psychologue donc, du photoplay, c'est-à-dire le cinédrame en français, on dirait aujourd'hui le film de fiction. Ce livre est tout à fait étonnant parce qu'on y voit déjà très bien développé une double idée qui est que le cinéma est un vecteur de fiction, il sert à raconter des histoires, parce que sa fonction, encore aujourd'hui, sa fonction principale dans la société, bien entendu, et d'autre part, c'est un vecteur de regard, c'est-à-dire qu'il dirige notre regard, et il le dirige même très fortement, puisqu'en outre, il le dirige en lui imposant une temporalité. Et ça, Münsterberg, que je n'avais pas encore nommé, mais le voilà nommé, Hugo Münsterberg, l'avait parfaitement compris, et au fond, je dirais que 80% des études de cinéma n'ont fait que développer ces deux directions qu'il avait esquissées fort bien il y a plus d'un siècle. Pourtant, il a fallu attendre assez longtemps pour que les études de cinéma prennent forme rationnelle. Pour des raisons très nombreuses, je crois. Je ne me risquerai pas à en faire l'histoire de façon tout à fait positive, mais il est clair que les universités n'étaient pas très chaudes pour accueillir cet objet d'étude. Je l'ai, moi, vécu en France dans ma jeunesse, c'était déjà après-guerre, mais on voyait très très bien, pardon de le dire, j'espère ne vexer personne, mais on voyait très très bien que les professeurs de littérature n'avaient pas envie de cette concurrence. Ils trouvaient que le cinéma, c'était pas fait pour la noble université. Il y a eu beaucoup de cette réticence. Et puis, il y a eu un autre phénomène, alors lui, positif en un sens, très positif, qui est, ça a été mentionné par Peter Kuon et Victor Stojkica, chacun à sa façon, c'est l'émergence d'une critique de cinéma qui a joué un très grand rôle dans la réflexion, y compris ultérieurement théorique, sur l'art du film. Je ne vais pas en faire l'histoire, mais dans les années 20, il y a eu en langue allemande des choses tout à fait importantes, écrites par Béla Balázs, qui était hongrois, par Siegfried Kracauer, par Rudolf Arnheim, qui était un des cofondateur de la Gestalt théorie appliquée à l'image. Il y a eu en France, après la guerre, quelques grands noms, le plus éminent étant celui d'André Bazin, qui a été une sorte de fondateur j'allais dire de chapelle, ce qui semblerait un peu péjoratif, mais fondateur de groupes de réflexion, disons-le. Et puis, il y a eu un certain nombre d'autres noms, y compris des États-Uniens, comme James Agee, par exemple, ou Manny Farber, qui étaient des amateurs, mais des amateurs de grand talent. Et avec tous ces noms, et bien d'autres que je n'ai pas le temps de nommer, s'était constitué, au fond, une sorte d'idée reçue. Le film s'est fait pour être traité par la critique, parce qu'il y a de bons critiques qui sont capables de distinguer les films importants, de dire pourquoi ils le sont, parce qu'ils inventent quelque chose, de dire quoi, et puis, petit à petit, d'aider à faire l'histoire des films. Tout ça va très bien, mais bien sûr, ça a été dit par l'un de mes deux anges gardiens, la cinéphilie a ses défauts, et son principal défaut qui est qu'elle est émotionnelle avant d'être rationnelle. Le choix cinéphile est un choix qui hésite toujours entre l'émotion et le dogmatisme, et évidemment, ça ne peut pas mener très loin. Il y a eu un épisode pour essayer d'introduire de la rationalité dans l'étude du cinéma. C'était un épisode issu de l'université et qui s'est d'ailleurs heurté de front à la critique en France. André Bazin a tiré à boulet rouge sur la filmologie. Cet épisode filmologique, c'est le seul moment où en français le mot filmologie a existé. Cet épisode filmologique, engagé par Étienne Souriau, le grand esthéticien, avait rassemblé des sociologues, des psychologues, peut-être même déjà des sémioticiens, et essayé donc de créer des études pluridisciplinaires du cinéma à partir d'applications des sciences sociales et humaines. C'était une idée tout à fait recevable, et bien entendu, intellectuellement parlant. Elle n'a absolument pas marché parce que l'institution, je crois, n'était pas prête à l'accueillir. Mais là-dessus, je vous renvoie à des histoires de la filmologie, je ne voudrais pas dire des choses trop simplificatrices. Les études de cinéma sont arrivées à l'université, je crois que c'est un point extrêmement mineur en principe, mais de fait qui a été important. Elles sont arrivées dans la foulée de 1968. Et du coup, j'étais en première ligne. J'étais à l'époque, après avoir résolu quelques équations différentielles entre 18 et 20 ans, j'avais occupé un poste d'ingénieur à la télévision qui m'avait amené par translation au cinéma. J'étais rédacteur au Cahier du cinéma et un jour, on nous a téléphoné de la Sorbonne pour demander si on voulait bien enseigner un peu aux étudiants. On ne savait pas trop quoi. J'ai sauté sur l'occasion. J'avais envie de parler devant des étudiants. C'était à peu près tout ce que je savais. Et nous avons vite compris, mes camarades et moi, que la critique ne suffisait pas. Il y a eu à ce moment-là une entreprise salvatrice. Elle a été nommée tout à l'heure. C'était la sémiotique. Plus exactement, ça s'appelait sémiologie. Et je crois que c'est grâce à la sémiologie et à Christian Metz que, pour ma part, j'ai été mis sur des rails un peu rationnels pour étudier le cinéma. Je passe très vite parce que, au fond, l'instauration des études cinématographiques, elle a surtout commencé, je crois, au moment où on a décidé qu'on ferait de l'analyse de films. Et Victor Stojkica l'a rappelé très très justement, ça ne pouvait pas se faire sans un matériel ad hoc. Le VHS a été pour nous, enseignants de cinéma débutants, une révolution merveilleuse. Avant le VHS, c'était ce que vous avez vu tout à l'heure un peu, le film qu'on projette et puis la pellicule casse ou brûle. J'ai brûlé un certain nombre de films devant des étudiants, que ça faisait rire d'ailleurs. Je dois dire que j'étais toujours un peu surpris. L'analyse de films a commencé au début des années 80 et je pense qu'on n'en est jamais sorti. Je veux dire par là que maintenant il est devenu tout à fait évident qu'étudier le film, c'est l'analyser. Quoi qu'on en fasse, qu'on soit historien, l'histoire du cinéma a redémarré à partir de l'analyse de films, sur de toute autre base, et elle est devenue, je crois, aujourd'hui un secteur extrêmement solide de l'université. La psychologie en a moins profité. Il y a eu moins de psychologues qui ont sauté sur l'occasion, mais pourraient tout à fait le faire. Et puis, bien entendu, l'analyse de films a été à la base aussi de ce qu'on appelle globalement les cultural studies, qui recouvrent beaucoup d'approches différentes aujourd'hui. Pour ma part, comme ça a été rappelé tout à l'heure, et j'ai tardé à y venir parce qu'au fond, l'essentiel a déjà été dit, je me suis surtout intéressé à un aspect qu'on pourrait nommer, pour aller vite, esthétique. L'esthétique, je ne savais pas ce que c'est quand j'avais 20 ans, ni même quand j'en avais 30. J'ai découvert peu à peu sur le terrain, et au fond, je n'en suis pas mécontent. J'ai commencé par faire des études sur le cinéma et la peinture, sur le visage au cinéma, un grand classique du cinéma muet, mais aussi, je l'ai découvert à ce moment-là, de tout le cinéma, au fond, dans son rapport à la figure humaine, sur la couleur. Toute une période de mon travail des années 80-90 qui se terminerait au fond avec un livre dont le titre est aussi très révélateur, cher Victor. Il s'appelait À quoi pensent les films ? C'est le mot « pense » là que je vais brièvement commenter parce qu'à l'époque, je croyais, ainsi que mes camarades, on était dans une période très euphorique, que l'image pensait vraiment. On a beaucoup joué avec cette métaphore. Donc quand même, on a fini par apercevoir un peu les limites, mais l'épisode de la reprise des idées d'Abby Warburg, du figural de Jean-François Lyotard, etc., ont mené très loin cette tendance à une croyance que l'image est vraiment quelque chose qui a des puissances propres. Et au fond, c'est une idée que je continue de soutenir aujourd'hui. Une image a des puissances propres, à condition, bien entendu, de ne pas penser que c'est elle qui fait le travail de penser, mais nous qui allons le détecter en elle. Bon, oui, j'avais prévu de vous remontrer ici le même échantillon que tout à l'heure, mais on ne va pas le faire, tout simplement pour enfoncer le clou de l'analyse de film. Une des choses évidentes qu'on a découvert quand on a commencé à revoir les films, c'est que revoir, ça n'est pas voir, c'est commencer à comprendre. Mais c'est tellement évident que vous n'avez pas besoin qu'on en fasse l'expérience devant vous, donc je passe. Je termine simplement le petit exposé chronologique de ce que j'ai fait et qui m'amène ici encore à ma surprise. Je le disais tout à l'heure, le premier théoricien du cinéma avait bien vu qu'il y avait d'un côté la fiction et de l'autre côté le regard, et après m'être beaucoup intéressé au regard, dans sa filiation picturale, dans sa rencontre du corps humain et du visage, dans son traitement de la couleur, qui est un problème tout à fait assez difficile finalement en cinéma, parce que la couleur bouge tout le temps, tout simplement. Elle n'arrête pas de changer. Après m'être intéressé à ça, je me suis réaperçu, et là je crois qu'il faut dire que c'est encore une fois l'évolution du cinéma qui a poussé à ça. Il y a eu énormément de discussions dans la décennie 2000-2010 sur un thème à la fois facile et impossible, qui est la fin du cinéma. Vivons-nous la fin du cinéma ? Se demandait-on avec angoisse il y a 15 ans. Bien entendu, ça n'était pas le cas. La mort du cinéma, j'en ai vécu plusieurs maintenant. Pour l'instant, il survit très bien, ce qui ne veut rien dire pour l'avenir. Mais dans mon cas, ça m'a ramené à étudier sans perdre de vue l'image, a étudié la relation entre la figure et la fiction, me souvenant d'une chose que j'avais apprise au passage, c'est que figure et fiction ne sont jamais que deux dérivés d'un même mot latin, et que par conséquent, il doit bien y avoir quelque chose qui les rassemble, et c'est à ça que je me suis attaché pendant les années 2000-2010, et encore un peu jusqu'aujourd'hui. Vous voyez que tout ça, je ne peux vous en donner qu'une idée extrêmement sommaire, et je m'en excuse, mais ce sont des travaux dont je ne sais pas si on peut les appeler théoriques. Je revendique le mot critique pour ma part, qui a une très belle histoire en philosophie. Il suffit de le faire remonter à son étymon grec, et on voit très bien que c'est un mot tout à fait noble. Je tiens évidemment à distinguer le travail critique que mes camarades et moi nous faisons à l'université de ce qui s'appelle critique de cinéma au quotidien, qui a d'autres contraintes, d'autres règles et d'autres objectifs. Je conclurai d'un mot en me félicitant bien sûr d'avoir obtenu ce prix extraordinairement honorifique, mais aussi en me félicitant d'avoir travaillé dans une discipline qui non seulement évolue sans cesse, mais d'autre part ne coupe jamais le chercheur de la société. Étudier le cinéma, c'est se ramener sans arrêt, quoi qu'on fasse, même quand on fait des choses assez abstraites, au fond, comme celles que j'ai pu commettre, on est toujours ramené à l'actualité. Je ne m'intéresse pas particulièrement aux mésaventures de M. Polanski actuellement, mais je ne peux pas non plus totalement les ignorer. Et si un jour, par chance ou par malchance, je vois son film « J'accuse », eh bien, je ne pourrais pas le lire sans savoir aussi qu'il a pris place dans une histoire non seulement des formes filmiques, non seulement des techniques cinématographiques, non seulement de l'idéologie gender, mais aussi dans l'histoire des événements cinématographiques propres qui ont leur logique, leur rationalité et leur chronologie. Et de ce rapport intime et permanent à mon objet d'étude, je me félicite tous les matins quand je me lève. Merci beaucoup.
Restez avec nous. Bene, per il multilinguismo della Confederazione leggo la motivazione in italiano per il conferimento del premio a Jacques Aumont per essere stato fondatore della filmologia come disciplina scientifica e universitaria, per il suo contributo alla definizione del concetto di estetica del cinema e di figurazione filmica, per il suo apporto all'interpretazione del linguaggio cinematografico e della sua storia. Non la leggo in romancio perché nel fascicolo che è stato distribuito non c'è il romancio e quindi non lo posso leggere, anche se io lo parlo correntemente. Detto questo, è aperta la discussione. So if someone wants to say or to ask something, I am sure that the two prize winners will be ready and available to give adequate answer. One question there. Professor Padoa-Schioppa, I think, isn't it? Is Professor Padoa-Schioppa? Yes. Yes, please.
Professor Cook has shown in his work and also in his speech of today the analogies, the common aspects, the similarities with the Western and not Western other religious cultures. What I want to ask is if he thinks that for the Islamic studies, the room, the space, both in Western universities, both in teaching and in research, should be widened, is sufficient, and if he has some ideas, some suggestions in this direction in order to make the Islamic culture, and mainly the classical Islamic culture, more known in West. Thank you.
You have the microphone.
So the question was about the role of the state in spreading knowledge of Islamic culture.
No, in the studies, in the university organization, in the teaching, in the both private and public university in the Western states, the Western world, about Islamic culture in its historical developments, because it is not so widely known, and it deserves to be better known, I think. But I want to have your suggestion on this.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think you're right that it deserves to be better known, and it would be good if it becomes better known. What I am a bit skeptical about is whether that kind of outreach to the public is going to have a serious impact on public attitudes. But what I could at least say is it's not going to do any harm, and it might do some good.
Thanks. So, other questions? Castello Blanco, please. Professor Castello Blanco, please.
Thank you. Well, thank you, both of you, for these wonderful lectures. And my question is to Professor Jacquemont. I'm wondering if you can tell us something about the place of sound and music in the study of film. This comes, of course, from someone who studies music, but it is, for me, the sound of film is as important as what I see on the screen. And I was wondering how much, what is the place that sound occupies for sound and music for researchers on film. I know that it's a growing field in music studies, indeed, that I'm aware of.
Je peux vous répondre en français?
Oui.
Je vais vous répondre d'abord par une anecdote. Le nouveau président de mon université, Paris-Sorbonne Nouvelle, est sorti vainqueur d'un concours organisé par les étudiants qui consistait à faire entendre des musiques de films et il fallait reconnaître le film d'où venait la musique. Ce président n'est pas du tout un filmologue et c'est lui qui a gagné contre tous les spécialistes. Bon, je ne vais pas tirer une leçon trop rigide de cette anecdote, mais elle signale bien quand même qu'il y a un léger déficit dans l'étude de la musique au cinéma que vous signalez au fond implicitement. Moi-même, lorsque j'ai parlé d'image, j'aurais dû dire image visuelle et image sonore. Le son dans les films, ce sont aussi des images. C'est le dialogue, bien sûr, mais même le dialogue a son rythme, sa musicalité, et donc constitue des images. Mais ces images-là sont beaucoup plus difficiles à étudier que les images visuelles qui ont la longue tradition de l'histoire de l'art qui les aide beaucoup. On a pris beaucoup de concepts, beaucoup d'idées et même des méthodes à l'histoire de l'art. On ne peut pas prendre directement à la musicologie pour des raisons évidentes. La musicologie est beaucoup trop technique, beaucoup trop spécialisée pour qu'on puisse lui reprendre des idées. Et je crois que c'est une des raisons du retard. Mais il y a eu quelques chercheurs importants sur le son au cinéma. Il y en a en France, il y en a en Angleterre, il y en a aux États-Unis et probablement ailleurs. C'est une branche des études cinématographiques et filmiques. Mon regret est qu'elle reste entre les mains de spécialistes pour l'instant. Et si j'avais 20 ou 30 ans de moins, j'essaierais d'agir pour qu'il y ait une symbiose plus forte avec les études sur l'image, parce que je crois que c'est possible. Sur la sensorialité, on peut échanger. Mais pour l'instant, en effet, il y a un certain retard, vous avez raison.
Merci. I don't see Professor Casanova. No, sorry.
No problem.
Sorry.
I just would like to make a compliment to colleague Cook for his very courageous presentation on Islamic and religions. My question was related to two events, Rohingya, and the second one, the behavior of the United States currently. in leaving Kurdi's place to Erdogan and so on. What do you think is the role of the United States in the Middle East in the near future?
Doctor.
Right, you're asking me to talk, as you're asking a medievalist to talk about the present situation and to talk about what might happen in the future. Well, let me say that when my undergraduates ask me about the future, I tell them that the university pays me enough to know about the past, but not enough to know about the future.
Good. So the question of...
I mean, the American response to your question would be good question, right? And I think we have so many things that look very unpredictable in the world today. We have an America with President Trump as president. He's unpredictable from this day to the next. We have no idea whether he will be re-elected. I mean, there are just too many things that are completely up in the air for me to give any kind of sensible answer to your question. And let me just say that, okay, I mean, usually I'm wise enough not to make predictions. I did make one prediction to my undergraduates about a year ago. I predicted that the Kurdish experiment in northeastern Syria would end badly because the Kurds have a reliable enemy, namely Turkey, and an unreliable ally, namely the United States. And I think President Trump has at least given me a great success with that prediction.
Okay. I hope that Maurice Campagna is satisfied by the answer. Anyhow, there is the whole sentence. I give you the... Oh, yes. You say... I don't see up to that.
That's fine. It's Erika Famutius, the pediatrician.
Okay. Yeah.
Obviously, I'm a pediatrician, but I have a question to Mr. Cook. I understood from... Yes. Okay. I understood from what you said that the sectarian... the duty which is related also to violence, is in a way related to either previous tribal societies and also to this association with the state. And I've heard that after the 30-year wars in continental Europe, one of the major progress, quote unquote, was to separate church religion from the state. Is this something that could explain in a way the difference in the Christian and in the Islam world in what are you describing?
Right. Now, of course, I mean, sectarianism is not a question that really comes into the duty of forbidding wrong, and we're discussing this on its own, right? Okay, I think, I mean, what I said about the sovereign state is maybe an attempted answer to your question. That is to say that, I mean, what you, okay, let me back off a bit. What you have in the Islamic world is sectarian groups which are committed in principle at least, and sometimes realized in practice, to create an intrinsically sectarian state, an imamate, somebody that is ruled by a ruler who is not a king, but who is an intrinsically religious figure. And you get that with Shiites in Yemen, you get it with the Ibadis in Oman. And I think what is different in the European case, you can of course have wars of religion, no question, but you don't have this idea that the sect should constitute an intrinsically religious state. With that, maybe we could continue this discussion afterwards.
Other question? If there are other questions, please say your name and stand up because I don't see very far. So,
My name is Børge Didriksen from the Balzan Committee. My question was actually quite close to yours, so maybe we can do it very short, also to Dr. Cook. So I was wondering if you could summarize the difference in the fault lines between the Shiites and the Sunnis and the Catholic Church and the various Protestant categories in the Western world. And related to that, when it comes to the Western world, the real justifications for many of the conflicts between Protestant and Catholics have been power struggles under the cover of religious motives, which were not the real motive for these struggles. Do you see a similar phenomenon in the Islamic world, so that the differences, the fault lines in religion is used as a pretext for power struggle? Thank you.
Yes, definitely. I mean, if we take the Saudi-Iranian relationship at the present day, that is a geopolitical rivalry, but it's also one that is articulated in strongly sectarian terms. I don't think there's any question about the reality of the geopolitical side of it, but I don't think that one should dismiss the sectarian side of it as mere top-dressing, as something that has no kind of real-world effects. I think, there are real sectarian fault lines and real sectarian tensions that get stirred up by this. In other words, what I would say basically is that, it's part of the human condition that you have practical and theoretical, or sort of pragmatic and principled things getting mixed up together. And I would certainly want to analyze the Saudi-Iranian relationship as a very mixed one.
Other questions? I don't see any other questions. So
yes, sorry.
Is there a question? Sorry.
Yes, I'm Reto Battaglia. I have a common friend with Professor Cook, that is Mr. Booth, as a scientist. But I have a totally unscientific question, or perhaps it is scientific as well. The concept of the duty to interfere against wrongdoing, viewed in the course of time, has it evolved? How do you see an involvement? What has been wrong in the past is very often not considered to be wrong today, tolerated. And how has it evolved differently in the Islamic world as opposed to the Christian world, or hasn't it evolved at all?
Right. I don't see that the ideas have evolved in any dramatic way over the last, shall we say, 1,000 years and a bit more. The practice of it is much less accessible. You have enormous amounts of this scholastic literature, but finding examples of it actually being done in practice is by no means impossible. But it's a matter of collecting very scattered references. So it's very hard to tell if there is some kind of sea change in the way or the extent to which the duty is performed. I think that's the limit of the honest answer I could give you to that question.
Good. I think we close the session, and before giving thanks again to both prize winner, and privately I will have some question to put to Professor Aumont, but privately because we are running out of time. And so before giving the floor to Mrs. Alpenseller, who should be here, I have to say some word, if you agree, Mrs. Alpenseller, just to write. First of all, I have to thank very much the prize winner for the splendid, marvelous lectures. Said in Latin, lectiones, which is another important language after all. And speaking in my role of institutional coordinator of the Commission Balzan, Lincei, and Prize winner, I want to thank very much the Swiss academies and the president of the academies, Professor Lopieno, and the General Secretary, Mrs. Aspenzeller. And I want to give you an early invitation to Lincei next year, autumn 2020, which will be the 10th anniversary of the institutional agreement among Balsan Foundation, Lincei, and Swiss academies, which started, after all, in 2011. I don't really know if number 3 is an important number, Professor Ambrosio. It is. It's good. I have some kind of icon to leave you. In my opinion, Balsan Foundation has 3 foundations. Seems to be a kind of oxymoron. The generosity of Balsan family. Secondly, the genius of Balsan Prize winner, and the importance of their research project. 3 foundations. It has also, in my opinion, 3 annual pillars: the Forum of Balsan Prize winner, the annual Balsan lecture, and the Interlab, which is another initiative which started in 2011. Next week, we will have in Rome, as Professor De Cleva very well known, the annual Balsan lecture of Bina Agarwal about gender studies in developing countries, which is a very, very important topic. And finally, I think that there are 3 bridges on which Balsan works: interdisciplinary, the 2 cultures, internationality, and intergenerationality, young and senior research. So I think it's a very peculiar, unique case in the history of the studies, research. While Professor Cook was speaking, it came to my mind a very old British sentence: the past is history, the future is mystery, and the present is a gift, and therefore it's called present. We are living our present, but as scientists, we look in the past and we look in the future. So, to conclude, arrivederci, au revoir, farewell, savet, which is Reto Romancio, e auf Wiedersehen to all of you. Many thanks.
Okay, and we are arrived at the closing of this wonderful meeting. Today, we were not only among researchers. Many of you are passionate in science, but are not scientists. And the prize winner won 2 prizes. They won the Balsan Prize, but they also won the challenge about how to explain us, who are not scientists, what they do, or to scientists of other discipline. I think you really had the gold medals. Thank you so much. It was very interesting to hear you. I remember we started with From the Bench to the Bedside, and we got new insights on translational research. And then we heard about diffusion, transport, interaction, changing shapes which are smooth. And we saw that 2 fields of research were joined together. It is fascinating to be in a moment where this was done. It was also fascinating to see how mathematics over generation has thought on problems. And they were over 300 years, people were thinking about how to solve him. And we are really in the point of a historic moment where we could see how these two problems were solved. Thank you so much for giving us an insight. It's, for me, like a little bit going to a wonderful restaurant and eat a wonderful dinner. I can eat it, but I can't cook it. Thank you so much. Then we also heard about Mr. Booth, and I think we ever will think of Mr. Booth because it shows us that listening is not enough and we have to experiment. And yes, we had also insightful thoughts about critical regions of our universe where problems are not solved so easily. And they are inherited and over long generations, and we hope research will find also how to change culture. Et puis, on a vu du cinéma. On a vu un cinéma devenu art au singulier. On a vu du cinéma qui était figuratif, qui relie à la figure, et qui était narratif, qui relie à la fiction. Et que nous sommes tous des citoyens, des critiques de cinéma, mais qu'il y a aussi en science des rails qui sont définis par la sémiologie. I would like to thank the Baldan Foundation and the Prize Committee to offer this moment of time to have insight in brilliant science and excellent science. I would also thank to our public. Science needs citizens. Science needs to be heard. And I would also thank to politicians who were present today. I saw Kati Ricklin, a member of our parliament, who always comes to our events, who is a scientist herself, but who is also a politician and is very passionate about science. And we saw also Mr. Cavalli, who is very engaged, he was very engaged in politics as well as for science. We are in a moment of time where it's important to think of science and policy and citizens at the same time. I would also like to thank Marius Leng, a flower artist, who was inspired by the presence of balsam. I looked at the flowers and I saw the branches of balsam. I saw the forms of the Swiss academies, and I saw how a lot of different flowers together make a whole bunch of flowers and a wonderful piece of art, as it happened today with all your speeches and your different disciplines of research. 2020, we will see you in Rome. We are only the guests as Swiss academies, but our scientists and the scientists of the whole world will have to file their proposals in Earth system dynamics, in environmental challenges, as well in social sciences as in technical sciences, to find new solutions for renewable energies and for human rights. So again, the Balzan Prize Committee found fields which are urgent, which need solutions, and I'm very curious to know what science brings us again. So at least I would like to thank everybody who was here. A special thanks to our teams in Switzerland as well as in Milano. It was nice to work together. And in a small way, we could show how we can work together between secretariats as well as with countries. Thank you very much. Don't forget to join us at the apéro. We are going to the Alpine Museum, where again, is it symbolic how the mountains shared by Switzerland and Italy are highlighted. Thank you very much for being with us.